Hi guys, welcome to Graphic Designer Pro. In today's tutorial we're going to be taking a look at different liquid effects in Adobe After Effects. I'm not going to be using any plugins, it's just using the inbuilt effects that are in After Effects itself. Graphic Designer Pro are currently also offering you the chance to download an After Effects template containing 7 separate logo reveal animations for just $7. So be sure to check out the link below to get that offer before it expires. Now let's get into After Effects and get going. So we're in After Effects, so let's make our composition first of all. I've got nothing created, this is just as you would open up After Effects. So let's go up to Composition in the top toolbar, New Composition. I'm going to call this Main Comp. I'm going to set my width and height to be 1920 by 1080 pixels, and I'm going to have my frame rate at 25 frames per second, but you can choose whatever frame rate you're happy to work with here. And my duration I'm going to keep at 10 seconds long, and I'm going to hit OK. Our composition has now popped up in our project panel and it's opened up for us down here in our timeline. Now first of all, let's create the background. So the background with the mixing paint kind of effect, we're going to do that first. So let's make a new solid. So right click in your timeline, new, solid. I'm just going to call this background. This can be any colour because we're going to be adding an effect that takes away the colour from it anyway. So we'll hit OK. We're going to go over to our effects and presets over here on the right. Now if this isn't here, go up to Window and go down to your effects and presets options here and make sure that it's ticked. I'm going to type into our effects and presets Fractal Noise. We're going to take the option underneath Noise in green, Fractal Noise, drag it on top of your background solid in the timeline. So you see how that takes the colour away by adding that effect, so it didn't matter what colour you picked for the solid there. We're going to go over to our effects controls now for this effect that we've put onto our solid. We're going to change the fractal type where it's currently at basic to be dynamic progressive. We're going to change the complexity down from 6 to be 1. See how that changes the appearance of it here in our composition window. And you see here where it says evolution, it's currently 0. If I move this and scroll this along and you watch our main composition window, you see how that's making it animate there. That's what we want it to do, but we want it to do that constantly. So I'll just Command Z to undo that. So we're going to add a little expression onto the evolution property so it'll animate over time. So hit Option or Alt on your keyboard and click the stopwatch beside evolution in your effects controls panel. You see your numbers here will go red, and down here we've got a little text box pop up for us to type our little expression, and all we're going to do is type time asterisk 150 and then just click off of it in the timeline. You see how it greys out there? You can go back into it anytime if you want to change the value by just clicking again once, and you see how it goes back to highlighted. We can minimize all of this up. Now if we go back to 0 in our timeline and hit the space bar, it's now going to animate for the whole of our timeline, which is what we want. Now we've created that moving noise effect. If we select it in the timeline, right click, pre-compose, you get this pre-composition options popping up here. We want to select Move All Attributes into the new composition, make sure that's selected, and make sure this is selected here. Adjust composition duration to the time span of the selected layers. Now we're going to rename this, let's call it Animated Noise, hit OK. We've now pre-composed that. We're now going to go back over to our effects and presets on the right hand side of our window. I'm going to add another effect here called Liquify. So if you type in Liquify, you see it will pop up here underneath the distort option. Drag that onto your animated noise pre-composition in the timeline and let that go. We've now got our effects controls pop up on the left here. So let's go into warp tool options and we're going to change the brush size, let's say to 100. Now let's change the brush pressure 100 as well. Enter. I might actually increase the brush size to be 150 just to get a bit of a larger surface area. And if you go up to your tools and select this first option here, which is like a little hand, your circle will appear and you can change it. If you click and drag in your composition window, you see how that distorts it here. So let's just drag this all out so it makes a nice mixed up kind of effect. Now you can see here, you can see the little bit of transparency grid popping through our effect because we're effectively dragging this away from the corner of our composition window, and we've got no background underneath that now. But undo that. So to fix that, you just pull in the opposite direction. So just make sure that you don't have any of your transparency grid showing in your actual composition window. Now you can also use this option here, which is your twist tools. So if we select that now, it's going to be the same brush size because we've set that for all of the different options, all the different tools that we have. And now if you click that, and use that. You see how that gives you more of a twist effect rather than just a dragging effect in the composition. And I think that looks pretty cool. We'll leave it like that just now. So now we want these swirls to move over time, to change their appearance. So if you go to 0 in your timeline, we're going to go over here to Distortion Mesh and toggle on the stopwatch at 0 seconds in the timeline. Now, let's go to about 5 seconds, so halfway through our composition timeline. And we're just going to change up the design using the exact same tools that we used to create the initial design. So go back up to your hand tool here and just change about your design. Now, this is going to be quite a heavy going effect for your machine. So you see over here, I've got my resolution at 1/4 of the resolution just while I'm working on this to stop any unwanted crashes or anything like that. But obviously remember to save your work as you go along. I'll go up and just hit save for now. Make sure it's saved as a sensible name and somewhere you know where it is. So now that we've done that, we'll go back to 0 in our timeline. You see how our design changes back to the original. Go to 5 seconds in the timeline. You see it's now the new design. Select your pre-composition in the timeline and press U. You'll see we've created 2 keyframes there. So now over time, between 0 and 5 seconds, our design is going to change. Our swirls are going to change about. And let's do the same at 10 seconds in the timeline. So again, go along to 10 seconds, which is the end of your timeline. Go back up to your tools and change about the design again. And you see as soon as I click and move anything, and change the design like this, you see it's created a keyframe for us straight away at 10 seconds. So you want to make sure you don't move your timeline cursor while you're changing the design, otherwise it'll make another keyframe at a different point in the timeline. So I'm happy with that last version of my design. I'm going to go back up to my selection tool up here, or you could just press V on your keyboard and that'll swap you back to your selection tool as well. I'm going to click off of anything in my timeline, minimize up that effect, and I'm going to double click into my pre-composition. So select it in the timeline and double click. We're back into this animated noise effect we've got here. Now what we want to do is go back over to our effects and presets. I'm going to change the colour now. So type tint and use this one underneath colour correction here. Drag that onto your background solid object, which was the initial thing that we created. You see now it's popped up in your effects controls panel, and we want to change the colours here. So let's do something, let's say a nice bright red, and then a dark red. You can change this later on if you want to try different colours as well. You just have to swap these 2 colours here. If we jump back to our main comp, you'll see what that's done to our design here. It looks quite cool now with that new colour. Now go back into your animated noise pre-comp. So if you've gone back to your main comp, just double click again into the pre-composition so you're in this composition with the background solid. And what we want to do is create another new solid in here. So right click, new, solid, and let's call this extra detail. And this can be any colour again, and just hit OK. Now double click on this extra detail solid we've just created in the timeline. So if you double click it, go up to your brush tool. And what I want you to do is go over to your colour over here in your paint options and change this to be black. Okay, I'm going to go up to where my brushes are as well, and I'm going to change the size of my brush to 19, or you can change it here where it says diameter. So let's say maybe 25, enter. So now you see we've got our little brush that we can draw onto this solid. Now we want to just draw on random squiggles. Perfect, so just random squiggles. Go over to your effects controls and where it says paint on transparent, check that option. Now, what we want to do is cross off layer extra detail because we went into that solid layer separately. We double clicked in the timeline. We cross that off now. We're back in our composition. We can now see those squiggles that we now created on top of that solid on top of our animated noise background. And because we checked paint on transparent, we don't have the background solid colour, we just see the lines that we've created. Now if you wanted to edit these at all, again, extra detail in the timeline, double click it, uncheck paint on transparent, you'll be able to see all your lines again, or keep that selected and just go to your transparency toggle at the bottom of your composition window, and to get back you just cross this off and you'll be back in your composition. Now what has this done? If we go back to our main comp now, you see the difference it's given it there. It's given it a bit more depth, an extra colour, and it looks really cool. So if we drag through our timeline now, see this moves over time. It gives quite a cool look to our background here. It's almost like paint mixing is what I think of it. And like I said, you can change the colour. Go back into our animated noise, select our background, and where that is where the tint is applied, and we can change the colour here. So let's change it to not quite as bright a red and make this a bit more brown. Okay, happy with that. Now, we want to import our logo or create any text at this point that we want to see on our liquid moving background. So I'm going to go into my project panel, right click, import, file, navigate to your logo or anything that you want to bring in at this point, select it, open, I'm going to hit OK and keep it as merge layers if it's an Illustrator file, OK. Now I've just noticed in my timeline here, because I've got the transparency grid turned on, I can see there's two little bits of the transparency grid popping through there. So make sure my pre-comp is selected in the timeline, go to my effect controls again, and I'm just going to select the brush and make sure I'm at a point where there's already a keyframe created at 0 seconds, and I'm just going to stretch this up. See, that just takes away that little bit of transparency grid there. Okay, I'm going to go back to my project panel and I've imported my logo here. I'm going to minimize things up from my timeline by just selecting it and pressing U. That just collapses everything up. I'm going to go and bring in my logo outline now into my main comp. I've got my logo here. I'm going to go over to my effects and presets now. I'm going to type in here fill. Drag in this one under here, underneath generate, drag that onto my logo. That just puts a fill color on top of the whole layer. I'm going to change this to be white. Okay, I'm going to select in the timeline and press S for scale and bring the size down to maybe just 25%. Perfect, maybe even 20 for what I'm going to do. I'm going to add in some text as well. I'm just going to drag this down by pulling down from the anchor point there. Now I'm going to go up to my text tool in the timeline, click anywhere in your composition window. I'm going to type something here as well. So I'm just going to use the word liquid. Double click it in the timeline. I'm going to change that to be white as well by going over to my character panel and changing the color like this. Okay, and I might increase the size by going back over to my character panel as well to about 175, let's say. Maybe even more than that. Let's go 200. Now what I'm going to do is go up to layer, transform, center anchor point in layer content with my text layer selected. That just centers the anchor point for me. I'm going to go back up to layer, transform, center in view with my text still selected, and now I know this is exactly in the middle of my composition, and I might just select my text and my logo in the timeline. They're both highlighted, which means they're both selected, and just tab this up so it just looks a bit nicer in the composition. Okay, so now we have our animated background happening. We also have our GDP logo or whatever logo you want to put in, and some text. Now what we want to do in our main comp is drag over those three layers to select them all, right click in the timeline, pre-compose. And we're just going to call this background. Make sure move all attributes into the new composition is selected and adjust composition duration to the time span of the selected layers is selected, and hit OK. What we're going to create now is the liquid drops that come over the composition and distort what is underneath it. Okay, now we've pre-composed our background, we want to select it in the timeline again, press Command D to duplicate it. With the top one selected, press Enter and call this liquid drops. Enter. And what we want to do now is pre-compose this again. So right click, make sure it's the top one that you've got selected, pre-compose, and call this liquid drops again. Make sure move all attributes into the new composition is still selected, and also adjust composition duration to the time span of the selected layers is selected. Okay, go into your liquid drops pre-composition, double click, select your liquid drops pre-comp inside there, press Enter and call this large drops. Click off of that in the timeline. Go over to your effects and presets and type in Mercury. Select this option here underneath simulation called CC Mr Mercury. Drag that on top of large drops pre-composition. See this kind of effect it's given it already, it's quite cool. So go over to your effects controls for this layer. So I'm going to change the X radius to be 100. I'm going to change the Y radius to be 55. See how that kind of scatters it about in the composition window. Change the location of the producer slightly. So I might bring it down here or up here by selecting a little anchor point and clicking, see what that looks like if we scroll through our timeline. I'm going to change my velocity to 0.1, the birth rate to 0.1. I'm going to change the gravity to be 2. I'm going to turn up the resistance to be 1. I'm going to change the birth size to be 2 and the depth size to be 1. Now I'm going to change the influence here to be 70%. So where it says blob influence, that just turns it down slightly. So see now we've got some quite large drops appearing on our screen, which looks quite cool. Now we want to add up a bit of different dimension into this, so what we're going to do is duplicate this now and create smaller ones as well, so we'll have large drops and smaller drops interacting slightly differently. So select large drops in your timeline, Command D to duplicate that, select Enter and rename that small drops, click off of it. And I'll change a few of the settings, so make sure you've got your small drops pre-composition selected, go over to your effects again. You can make sure you're in the correct pre-composition for the effects because it'll tell you up beside where it says effects controls what it is the effect controls of. So it's telling you it's the effects controls for the small drops pre-composition. And if I change that to be large drops down in the timeline, you see the name changes up here as well. So sometimes if you're not sure, you've got a lot of things going on, just give it a wee double check up on the top here. So I'm going to change the velocity to be 0.2, the resistance to be 1.5, the influence to be 40%, the birth size to be 1, the depth size to be 0.5. And I'm going to change the location of the producer again. Go up to where it says producer, select the little anchor point tool like this and click somewhere in my composition. So they'll have a different producer point. Now let's go back to our main comp. Now see, that's appeared on top of our moving background already and it distorts what's underneath it. If I turn this up to be full resolution, you'll see how clear it actually is on the corners. It looks really smart. And you can add or take away as many drops as you want for this effect. So you can play around with this, all these different settings in your large drops and small drops compositions. Let's go back to my main comp again. So we're going to add one more effect here, but this time onto our background. So you go back over to effects and presets and type in glass. Select this option here underneath stylize called CC glass. Drag that on top of your background composition in your main comp and let that go. Now you see what that's done there, it's kind of almost embossed what was underneath it, but we don't really want that kind of effect. So we want to go over to our effects controls for this layer and this effect, go into surface, and we want to change the bump map to, instead of being background, to be the liquid drops, and that's changed it straight away. Now I'm also going to change the property here to be, instead of lightness, to be alpha. And that's created a bit of a shadow around our drops as well, so they're a bit more obvious on the screen and I think it makes it look a bit cooler. If we go now into shading and turn up the ambient to maybe, let's say 70, if I just scroll up like this, it brightens up the whole thing. I might even bring that down to be 65. Perfect. So we're pretty much there. Just going to go up and file, save in case of any disasters. And one little thing I like to add sometimes on my animation is just a little vignette on the outside of my composition. And I'm just going to do that by creating a solid. So right click in the timeline, new, solid, select a black color for this. Okay, okay. Make sure it is on top of everything in your timeline. Go up to your shape tool and go down to your ellipse tool. Let go. We've now got our ellipse. If you double click on the ellipse tool now with your black solid selected, this has now created a mask the exact size of your composition window in that shape. We now want to go into our mask here, it's popped up for us, and select inverted. Hit F on the keyboard for feather. See, we've got our mask feather now. Let's turn this up to 300. See, that feathers the edges for us, and if we hit our black solid and hit T for opacity, I'm going to turn this down to be about 30% as well. And this just adds a little bit of depth to the whole thing, so it just brings it all together. I quite like adding it, not for everything, but I think for this it just brings the whole thing together. Now if we go back to 0 and let this load, it's going to be quite full on for your computer to try and compute all these layers together, but if we turn this down to a quarter and let this load, you can drag through your timeline and see what this looks like. So if we just want to send this to render now and see what we've made. So that's it guys, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, remember to hit like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content like this. See you in the next one.